The town of Crale's Crossing had a tradition. Every year, on the last Sunday of October, the families of the town gathered for what they called a harvest dinner. It had been happening for as long as anyone could remember, longer than the oldest resident could trace, longer than the church records went back, longer than the deed to the oldest property in the county. It predated, as far as anyone had established, the town itself. The dinner came first. The town had grown up around it the way towns grew up around rivers and crossroads and other things that made a place worth staying. Every family brought a dish. Every family attended. The dinner was held in the old Granger Hall on the edge of the town square, a building that had been a granary, and then a meeting house, and then simply the place where the harvest dinner happened. Because by the time anyone thought to ask what was for it, had already been the place for longer than the question seemed worth asking. There were rules, not written rules, the kind that were understood, the kind that were communicated through the specific way an older resident looked at a younger one when a younger one came close to breaking them, a look that communicated both the rule and the consequence in the same glance, without words, with the efficiency of a tradition that had been enforcing itself for a very long time. The rules were these. Everyone attended. No exceptions for illness, travel, or personal objection. If you were a resident of Crale's Crossing, you came to the harvest dinner. You brought food, something you had made yourself, in your own kitchen, from ingredients you had prepared. Nothing purchased, nothing from outside the town. You ate what was served, all of it, whatever was placed in front of you, from whatever dish, prepared by whatever neighbor. You ate completely. You did not ask what was in it. You did not comment on the taste. You ate, and you stayed until the guest was satisfied. This was the rule that visitors to Crale's Crossing, the rare ones passing through, occasionally staying, found most puzzling when they heard it mentioned, because Granger Hall, on the last Sunday of October, contained only the residents of Crale's Crossing. There were no guests. There was nobody from outside. The hall was closed to outsiders on that night, the doors shut and the windows dark, and the dinner happened inside without witnesses who weren't already part of it. Who was the guest? The residents of Crale's Crossing did not answer this question directly. They smiled, most of them, in a way that was not unfriendly, and they said, "You'd have to stay to find out." The journalist who decided to find out was named Theo Marsh. He was 28 years old, worked for an independent online publication that specialized in long-form investigations of unusual local traditions and the communities that maintained them. He had written about a town in the Southwest that held an annual lottery involving the redistribution of property. He had written about a coastal village that maintained a strict prohibition on fishing during a specific 3-week window every spring, backed by a social enforcement so total and so quiet that no one in the village had broken it in living memory. He had particular interest in the ways that small communities develop and maintain practices that outsiders found strange, and that insiders found simply true, the cultural logic of things that looked, from the outside, like superstition, and that turned out, when you look more closely, to be something else. He found Crale's Crossing in October, 3 weeks before the dinner. He drove in on a Wednesday, checked into the only rental available, a room above the hardware store owned by a family named Pell, offered through a listing that described it as quiet and reasonably priced, both of which were accurate. And he spent the following 2 weeks doing what journalists did, talking people, eating at the diner, attending the things that were open to attend, and slowly building the texture of a place until he understood it well enough to ask the right questions. Crale's Crossing was a town of about 800 people, set in a river valley in a part of the country where the landscape was beautiful in a way that suggested it had never been entirely domesticated. The farms around the town were productive and well-maintained. The people were friendly in the specific way of small communities that were accustomed to being self-sufficient and had no particular need for outside approval, but were not hostile to it either. They went to church on Sundays. Their children went to the school on Birch Street. Their dead went to the cemetery on the hill behind the old Granger Hall. where the headstones went back to the early 1800s, and the older section had markers and materials and scripts that were not immediately legible to a person trained in contemporary English. He noticed two things in his first week. The first was that nobody in Crale's Crossing was sick, not in the way that an 800-person town was normally sick. The seasonal colds, the chronic conditions, the elderly with their accumulated complaints, the children with their school-transmitted viruses. The town had a medical clinic on Main Street, staffed 2 days a week by a doctor who drove in from the county seat. He was by all accounts underworked. The pharmacy next to the hardware store carried a standard inventory that moved slowly. The residents of Crale's Crossing were, as far as Theo could observe, in exceptional health across every age group. The second thing he noticed was the cemetery. Specifically, the dates on the headstones. He walked through it on a Thursday afternoon in the thin October light, and he read the markers, and he did the arithmetic that journalists did automatically with numbers. And what he found was this: the residents of Crale's Crossing lived long. Not unusually long by modern standards, nothing that would make a headline, but consistently long across generations, with uniformity that was statistically improbable. The markers in the old section showed lifespans of 80, 85, 90 years, in a period of American history when the average was considerably shorter. The markers in the newer sections showed the same. Not one resident of Crale's Crossing, in the records he could read, had died before the age of 73. He sat on a bench in the cemetery and looked at this pattern for a long time. Then he went back to his room and he typed, "What are they eating?" He asked the harvest dinner question on his 8th day to a woman named Vera Colm, who ran the diner and had the quality of a person who had answered most questions before and had a filing system for her answers. She said, "It's a community tradition. Every family, every year, last Sunday of October." He said, "I've heard there are rules." She said, "There are ways it's done, like any tradition." He said, "I'd like to attend." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "It's residents only." He said, "Is there a formal definition of resident?" She said, "People who live here." He said, "I've been renting a room above Pell's Hardware for 8 days. She looked at him again. A longer look this time. Not unfriendly, not hostile. The look of someone consulting an internal reference she didn't share. She said, "You'd have to bring a dish." He said, "I can cook." She said, "Something you make yourself, in your own kitchen, from ingredients you prepare." He said, "I understand." She said, "And you'd have to eat what's served, all of it, without asking what's in it." He said, "I understand." A pause. She said, "And you'd have to stay until the guest is satisfied." He said, "Who is a guest?" She smiled, the same smile he imagined, that every resident of Crale's Crossing smiled at this question. She said, "You have to stay to find out." He said, "Then I'll stay." He spent the following week preparing. He cooked, genuinely, in the small kitchen in his room above Pell's Hardware, a beef and root vegetable stew that had been his grandmother's recipe and that he was good at, having made enough times that the process was automatic. He bought the ingredients from the general store on Wednesday. He made the stew on Saturday. It was good. It was honest. It was the kind of food that a person brought to a community gathering, without embarrassment. He arrived at Granger Hall on Sunday at 6 in the evening, which was when Vera Colm had told him to arrive. He carried the stew in a ceramic pot sealed with foil. The hall was already filling when he got there. The residents of Crale's Crossing arrived in families, parents and children and grandparents, the full span of ages, everyone dressed in their ordinary clothes rather than anything formal, carrying dishes of food in a comfortable manner of people who have been doing this their whole lives. They greeted each other. They set up long tables with the practiced efficiency of people who did this every year in the same space with the same furniture. They set their dishes at the center of the tables, and they took their seats, and they waited. Nobody greeted Theo specifically. Nobody was unfriendly. He was simply incorporated into the gathering without ceremony, shown to a seat at one of the long tables by a man who introduced himself only as Pell, his landlord, he realized, and left there with the assumption that he understood what came next. He set his stew at the table with the other dishes. He looked at the food. There was a great deal of it. Every family had brought something: casseroles, roasts, pies, breads, soups, dishes he could identify and dishes he could not. The hall smelled of cooking, of warmth, of the specific amalgam of community's food brought together in one space. And it was a good smell, a deeply ordinary smell, the smell of people who knew how to feed themselves and each other. He took out his phone to photograph the table. The man beside him, Pell, his landlord, a large, quiet man in his 50s, put a hand briefly on Theo's wrist. Not hard, just a touch. Pell said, "No photographs inside. It's one of the ways it's done." Theo put his phone away. He said, "Of course. I'm sorry." Pell said, "It's fine. You didn't know." Then the lights in the hall dimmed, and the dinner began. The food was passed in a specific order that the residents seemed to know without being told, counterclockwise, each dish making its way down the table, each person serving themselves and then passing. The whole operation conducted in a quiet that was not unfriendly, but was very deliberate. No one spoke while the food was being distributed. No one said grace. No one gave a speech. The food moved and people served themselves, and then, when every plate was full, the quiet broke and the conversation resumed and people ate. Theo ate. The food was good, genuinely, straightforwardly good. The food of people who cooked from habit and competence rather than performance. The food of a community that fed itself well. He ate the things he could identify and the things he could not, because those were the rules and he had agreed to them, and nothing tasted wrong. Nothing tasted strange. Everything tasted like food made by people who knew what they were doing. He was halfway through his plate when he noticed a dish. It was in the center of the table. 3 places to his left, a large ceramic serving dish with a lid that had not been opened yet. Every other dish on the table had been circulated. This one had not moved. The residents around it ate from their plates without reaching for it, without acknowledging it, with a particular quality of not looking at something that is more deliberate than looking at it would be. He looked at IT. IT was old. The ceramic was the kind of old that you could see in the quality of the material, the way it had absorbed decades of use. The glaze darkened and the surface, carrying the history of a thing that had been handled by many hands over a long time. There was no serving spoon beside it. There was no label. It sat in the center of the table, and the residents ate around it, and the dinner continued, and nobody touched it. Theo reached for it. The conversation at his end of the table stopped. Not all the conversation in the hall, just the immediate local silence of the people near him. They did not tell him to stop. They did not move to prevent him. They simply stopped talking and looked at him with the expression of people watching something happen that they had seen happen before. He lifted the lid. He could not immediately identify what was inside. It was a stew, liquid-based, dark, the surface still warm, steam rising slowly in the dim light of the hall. There were solid components, things that had been cooked down to a consistency that made them difficult to distinguish individually. It smelled. He inhaled carefully, trying to be objective. It smelled like meat, a strong, specific, gamey quality that he could not match to any animal he could immediately name. Rich and dark and very concentrated. The smell of something that had been cooked for a very long time. He looked at the residents nearest to him. They were watching him. Not with alarm, not with warning, with the patient attention of people waiting to see what he would do. He said, "What is this?" The woman across from him, he did not know her name, said, "It's the guest's dish." He said, "The guest brought a dish?" She said, "The guest is the dish." He looked at her. He looked back at the ceramic pot with its dark contents. He said, "I don't understand." The woman said, "Yes, you do." And the thing was, he did. Not the way he wanted to understand it. Not with the part of his mind that dealt in facts and sources and a verifiable record. But with the older part, the part that processed things before language got to them. The part that had been sending him signals since he walked into the hall, and that had been managing and contextualizing and overriding with professional habit. He understood. He said, "Who?" The hall was very quiet now. Pell said beside him, gently, "It's not a who. Not anymore. It hasn't been a who for a very long time." Theo said, "How long?" Nobody answered. He looked around the hall. 800 people. The entirety of Crale's Crossing, eating their food at long tables in the warm light of Granger Hall. Healthy people, long-lived people, people whose dead did not die young, whose children did not get sick, whose farms produced and whose community endured, and whose tradition went back further than the town itself. He thought about what he had typed in his room 8 days ago. Were they eating? He looked at the dish. He said, "Every year." Pell said, "Every year." He said, "And everyone?" Pell said, "Everyone eats." "Yes," he said, "the whole town." Pell said, "It's a community tradition." Theo sat with this for a long time. The hall was quiet around him, the particular quiet of people waiting for a thing to be decided. And he thought about 800 people in a tradition older than the town and the cemetery on the hill where nobody died young, and the clinic that was underworked and the pharmacy that moved its inventory slowly. He thought about the rules. You ate what was served. All of it. Whatever was placed in front of you. He thought about the fact that the dish in the center of the table had not been served to him. It had been placed where he could see it, where he could reach it, where he could lift its lid. It had been left for him to find. He thought, this is not an accident. He thought, the whole town watched me reach for it. He thought about the question he had asked Vera Colm at the diner. "I'd like to attend." And the question she had asked back, "Is there a formal definition of resident?" He thought about the fact that they had let him in. He said, "You let me come here on purpose." Nobody denied this. He said, "You needed someone who didn't know." Pell said, "We need someone new every few years. The guest requires it. It's the agreement." He said, "The agreement with what?" Pell said, "With what provides." Theo sat very still. He thought about 800 people who did not get sick, who did not die young, whose children thrived and whose farms produced and whose community had endured for longer than anyone could trace. He thought about what that required, what that cost, what that meant about the dish in the center of the table and its contents and the agreement that Pell said underpinned all of it. He said, "What happens if I don't eat it?" The hall was completely quiet. Vera Colm, from further down the table, said, "Then someone else goes in the dish next year." He looked at her. She said, "We don't choose who. It chooses. It has always chosen. This year it chose you. It chose you before you chose to come here. You understand that, yes? You found us. You thought you found us." He thought about the listing for the room above Pell's Hardware, the publication that had sent him to look for unusual community traditions, the specific trail of research and intuition and professional instinct that had led him to Crale's Crossing on a Wednesday in October. He thought about the word found. He thought about the word led. He said, "And if I eat it?" Vera Colm said, "Then you're a resident." A pause. She said, "You brought a dish. You followed the rules. You came in good faith. If you eat what's served, all of it, you're one of us." He said, "And I stay." She said, "Most do." He said, "And if I leave?" The silence that followed was very long and very complete and contained its own answer. He sat for a very long time. He thought about his grandmother's recipe and the ceramic pot of stew he had brought and the fact that it was now empty, served and eaten by the residents of Crale's Crossing who had taken it without comment or question, as the rules required. He thought about what it meant that they had eaten his food. He thought about the journalist's instinct that had brought him here, the conviction that there was a story, that there was something worth understanding, that small communities with unusual traditions were interesting rather than dangerous. He thought about how that instinct had felt completely his own. He thought about the dish in front of him. He thought about being 73 and still being the youngest person in the cemetery on the hill. He picked up the serving spoon. He served himself. He ate. It tasted. And he spent a long time in the years that followed trying to find words for this, finding each time that language failed a specific point, like a road that ended without warning. It tasted like something that had been many things before it was this, like a history compressed into a flavor, like memory made edible. It tasted, if he was honest, like the best thing he had ever eaten, and the horror of that was worse than anything else about the evening, worse than the dish and its contents and the agreement and the choosing, because he had expected it to be terrible, and it was not terrible at all. It was exactly what he needed. He finished his plate. Around him, the hall exhaled, not literally, not audibly, but in the way that a room changes when a decision has been made that changes it. Pell put a hand on his shoulder. He said, "Welcome." The dinner continued. The conversation resumed. The residents of Crale's Crossing ate and talked and passed food, and the hall was warm, and the food was good, and the evening was, in every observable way, exactly what a community dinner should be. Theo sat among them. He did not take out his phone. He did not write anything down. He stayed until the guests were satisfied, which took until nearly midnight, and he knew when it happened because the dish in the center of the table was empty and the ceramic was cold, and the air in the hall changed in a way he felt rather than perceived, a release, a completion, the specific quality of an agreement honored. He walked home to his room above Pell's Hardware in the cold October night, and he sat at the small desk, and he opened his laptop, and he looked at a document he had been building. 2 weeks of notes, observations, the threads of what was going to be a long-form investigation of an unusual community tradition. He sat with it for a long time. Then he deleted it, not impulsively, carefully, with the consideration of someone making a decision they understood the weight of. He deleted the document, and he emptied the trash, and he closed the laptop, and he sat in the quiet of his room above Pell's Hardware, and he thought about what he was now and what he was not anymore, and about the cemetery on the hill, and the names on the headstones, and the age at which they had died, and how long 73 years was when you were 28. He thought about his grandmother's recipe. He thought about the harvest dinner. He thought about next year. Theo Marsh never filed a story. His editor called twice in November. He said he found nothing of interest in Crale's Crossing and was moving on to other assignments. He did not move on to other assignments. He rented the room above Pell's Hardware on a monthly basis, and then on an annual basis. And after 2 years, he bought a small house on the edge of town, which he paid for with money his family found puzzling given his income, which had not changed. He wrote sometimes, for himself, in notebooks that he kept in a drawer and never showed anyone, about the tradition, the dinner, the dish in the center of the table, not as a journalist, as a resident, as someone who wanted a record, even a private one, of what he understood and how he had come to understand it. In his 4th year in Crale's Crossing, he began attending the planning committee for the harvest dinner. In his 7th year, he was the one who set the dish in the center of the table. He was good at finding people. He had always been good at finding people. He had come to understand the reason he had been chosen. The tradition required a finder, someone who moved through the world with the professional instinct of a person looking for things worth investigating, someone who could locate, each year, the person who was supposed to come, not a victim. The tradition did not work with victims. It required willing participants, people who sat with what they understood and reached for the serving spoon anyway. Theo Marsh was very good at finding those people. The listing for the room above Pell's Hardware was his idea. He updated it every October. He described it as quiet. He described it as reasonably priced, both of which were accurate. And every year, On the last Sunday of October, someone new sat at the long table in Granger Hall and looked at the dish in the center and understood and reached for the spoon anyway. And every year, the guest was satisfied, and the tradition continued, as it always had, as it always would.